Tuesday night. So this is a very historic day because I've only just twigged why Parkinson's Awareness Week is this week. Because actually it's James Parkinson's birthday. So 262 years ago he was born, so on the 11th of April 1755, and he wrote his famous essay, which he did not call Parkinson's disease himself. That was named by a later neurologist. He wrote his famous essay in 1817, and James Parkinson's a very interesting man. I won't bore you too much about him, but I mean, he was a founding member of the Royal Geographical Society. At the time of his death, he had I think the finest fossil collection of anybody in Europe. He was questioned by the Prime Minister for some of his political views, because he was a great political activist who tried to actually change things for the better for the poorer people of the East End of London where he lived. So he was a sort of extraordinary man, and he was essentially a GP. That's what he was. He ran his practice out in the East End of London. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to take you through a little bit about sort of some of the work we've done around trying to look at different types of Parkinson's disease. So sort of idea that there may be more than one type, or at least the disease may behave in two very different ways, and then how we use that information to decide about new therapies. And I'm going to particularly talk about cell therapies, because that's what I'm quite interested in, that's what we do trials on, and that's probably what we're best known for. And at the end I'm going to talk a little bit about some very new theories, which some of you may have heard me bang on about before, which is this whole idea about Parkinson's disease as a spreading protein disease, looking to the future and the idea of vaccines to treat people for this condition. And then when I finish, Nushan's going to come and talk to us about something that's a bit more basic and getting really to the heart of the problem. So I'm not going to talk a lot about what goes wrong inside cells, but Nushan's going to tell you everything that he knows about that and more. So what is Parkinson's disease? Well, we all know what Parkinson's disease is, because we've essentially known people with it, have the condition ourselves, or family members. So this is classically defined, and this is what James Parkinson described in his 6 patients. Not all of them were his patients, actually. So in the first 6 patients he described, I think 2 were his own patients, and 4 were people he saw walking around the East End of London. He went up to chat to them. I mean, nowadays if you did that, you'd end up in front of the GMC and be in all sorts of trouble. But he defined it as this tremor, slowness of movement, stiffness, and balance problems, and that still is how it's largely defined nowadays. And it is defined, and this is critical to the story that will be coming out tonight, it's critically defined by the loss of these cells here. So this is the front of your brain, this is the back of your brain, this is the stem of the brain, which is just above your neck here. And at the top of this stem are 2 areas which are black, hence they're called the substantia nigra, and sitting within those you have 500,000 dopamine cells. So you have 500,000 on this side, 500,000 on that side, and they project up from here into this structure called the striatum. And they're rather technical terms, but if you just remember nigra dopamine cells and project up here, and those 500,000 dopamine cells release dopamine here, and that controls vast numbers of behaviours. So it controls movement, it controls some of our thinking, and cells which lie near this and project up to other areas control drug addiction. So people who have problems with drug addiction, it's a dopamine system there. So this is a very important system, but essentially when you lose half of these 500,000 cells, you end up with these features of Parkinson's. So 250,000 cells die on each side, you get Parkinson's disease. And you have to take that in the context of a brain that has about 100 billion cells. So remember that number, because that number is trackable. We can get to that and treat it using cells. Now, Parkinson's disease, by virtue of the fact that it's lost this chemical, dopamine projecting up here, means there are vast numbers of drugs which we now use in the clinic. So some of you will be familiar with this. This is cinnamettamidopar. So all these drugs are essentially used at the moment, and they all basically work on dopamine. So you either stop dopamine being broken down, they act like dopamine, they replace dopamine, or you infuse things to these 2, or you stimulate bits of the brain to try and undo the bits that have gone wrong because the dopamine's not there. So there are all of those therapies. So we have lots of effective therapies. The trouble is they don't work forever, and the problem they do is that they start to become less effective and produce their own side effects. So that is a problem. But this is our sort of simple view, if you like, of Parkinson's disease. Lose these cells, all these treatments, and this is the classic feature. But we know that not everyone looks the same. So we know that some people have a lot of problem with balance and fall. Some people have problems with thinking. Some people have a lot of tremor. So one of the projects we set about 17 years ago now was to try and understand this by collecting everyone with Parkinson's disease in Cambridgeshire. And so what we found with that is the average age to get Parkinson's disease is 68. There's a new case of Parkinson's disease diagnosed in Cambridgeshire every 4 to 5 days. So this is a common condition. And what we found was, by following these people over time, and we still follow them today, is that they're essentially patients who are younger, so these tend to be people in their 50s and early 60s who have no problems with their thinking, and there's people who tend to be in their 70s or 80s who are the older patients with Parkinson's who do have problems coming up with lists of animals, naming lots of animals in a given period of time, and copying shapes. And when these people come to the GP or come to us for the first time, this group, unfortunately, have a worse prognosis in that they tend to be people who run into thinking problems earlier on and run into problems with dementia. So these people have a disease which is rather different to this, where it's younger people and it stays very much as a problem of movement. Now we try to understand that, and so we look at agents which are being touted as possible disease modifying, and these vaccines and immune therapies that I will come to at the end. Now it's important to grasp this, because what's happened in this field is people haven't taken this into account. So the sort of clinical trial is you get 12 people with any sort of Parkinson's disease, 6 here, 6 here. You make a beautiful dopamine cell therapy, you put it in the brain, and you say after 2 or 3 years, how are you feeling? Well, this group over here feel crackerjack. You know, they say, I've had the therapy, it works fantastic, everything's much better, terrific. This group, the cells are still there, doing wonderful things, but now they've got major problems with thinking, which has got nothing to do with dopamine. You say, how are you feeling? They say, well, actually, I'm no better. In fact, I'm much worse. My thinking's gone off, I can't do things properly. So they'll say, oh, they're much worse, they're much better, 6 better, 6 worse, average them up, no difference. Bin it, move on. And you may think that's very simplistic, but so far, that has happened with cell therapies, gene therapies, and growth factor therapies. So all of them, 10 years ago, were essentially disappearing as not being useful in Parkinson's. And so for the last decade, we've been trying to rescue them to say that we can use them. And that's what I'm going to really talk about most now, is these mainly dopamine cell-based therapies. So that's what I'm going to concentrate. I'm not going to talk about genes and growth factors, but I'm very happy to talk to people about that. So just to take you back through the sort of past, really. So just so we've got ourselves all on the same page, what are we trying to do with cell-based therapies for Parkinson's? Well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to repair the critical thing, as I say, which is the loss of these 250,000 dopamine cells. Now, is that likely to work if we put those cells back? And we know it's a core event, but is it going to work? Well, yes, because we know when we give people oral dopamine, they do very well. So I'm sure all of you have seen people in the early stage of Parkinson's, you give them dopamine, Cinemet, Manapart, they look almost entirely normal. So we know that if we can put dopamine back, it should have a dramatic response. So what we're trying to do with our cells is put dopamine in the form of a cell into the brain. And that is going to be better than any drug therapy for 2 major reasons. And the 2 major reasons are that when you take oral dopamine, 2 things happen to it. One is it goes everywhere in your brain, so it will stimulate anywhere where dopamine is working. So some of the problems people have with thinking, some of the hallucinations people have, some of the behavioural problems they have, it's all related to dopamine stimulating bits of the brain it shouldn't do. The second thing is when you take an oral drug, it gets in and then it just dollops itself in the brain, and then you just use it and then it wears off. That's not how dopamine works in real life. Dopamine comes in little bursts from nerve cells. And so that so-called non-physiological stimulation of the dopamine system when you take the tablets ultimately leads to all of the involuntary movements that people get. So the dyskinesias, as they're called, these involuntary movements, are a consequence of the non-physiological stimulation of brain with tablets. So if I stick my dopamine cells in the brain where you've lost dopamine most, I'm going to avoid stimulating bits of the brain I don't need to, and I'm going to release dopamine in a normal way. So in theory, I should put that system back to normal, and if I did it at the beginning, in theory, I should stop all of the motor complications that people get with Parkinson's disease. So that is the rationale. So I'm not curing it, I'm not getting rid of Parkinson's disease, I'm simply targeting one of the key areas which we know responds very well to oral dopamine therapies. Well, how good is good? So this is a patient who had Parkinson's disease for 10 years, began in the 1980s. He went to Sweden and had a transplant of fetal dopamine cells, so developing dopamine cells into his brain 2 decades before this video was taken. So this is what he looks like. Probably won't work now. This is what he looks like 30 years into Parkinson's disease on no medication, with transplants of fetal dopamine cells in both sides of his brain. So when I was first shown this video, they said, what do you think of his Parkinson's disease? And I said, well, I don't know who diagnosed him, but clearly he hasn't got Parkinson's disease, he looks normal to me. So that is the response you get. You can see that he looks pretty normal. It's clearly not quite normal, because when he's pulled he has that stuttering gait. But if you look at his motor scores, which are done on these standard scales, his score 30 years into his illness was less than when he presented 30 years previously. So when it works well, it works very well. And in his particular brain, he also had normal dopamine levels when they scanned it. So clinically, when it works very well with fetal dopamine cells. It also, so the patient looks well, the imaging looks good. This is a patient that was reported last year. This is a chap who died in 2013. He'd had a dopamine cell transplant in 1989, having had Parkinson's disease diagnosed in 1979. This, you can't really see it here, this is the side of the brain with no transplant. So brown are dopamine. So on the non-transplanted side, there's absolutely nothing. On the transplanted side, you can see here these lovely transplants with all these fibres growing into the brain. So a quarter of a century later, the patients are better, they have surviving transplants. Not only does it improve them in terms of motor, it survives on non-motor aspects, so sleep, apathy, things like that. There are aspects of that that even improve with these transplants. And finally, coming back to a point I made at the beginning, these cells also release dopamine, just like the normal dopamine cells. So this is a scan of this patient in 1999 showing that that transplant released dopamine in the normal way in the brain. So it works fantastically well. So then the question is, well, why hasn't everyone had this? So the problem was that it was incredibly variable. So some people did fantastically well, and some didn't do very well, and some had some few side effects. And that probably related to the selection of the patients, which I talked about, and it also related to some other problems that people had, that they didn't quite know how much tissue to put in and various other problems. So that created a very negative view when it came to the beginning of this century, because 2 big trials in America which took this approach found it didn't work and produced side effects. And that's because they chose patients at the wrong stage of the disease, the wrong type of patients, they transplanted them in the wrong way. So we spent many years trying to work out who does best with this so we could do a new trial. And we decided that the patients who did best with this were exactly the patients I've already told you about, the younger patients who were actually earlier in the disease course. Unlike any of the other trials, we worked out how to deliver the tissue, the fetal dopamine cells, in a way that was consistent rather than just sort of how I felt on the day. And we worked out how to deliver it so we could deliver it across the brain in a proper fashion, and then we immunosuppress patients. Well, this trial, which was funded by the good old EU, started in 2010, took us 5 years because of trying to work this out and to get all the regulation before we transplanted our first patient. We have currently transplanted 9.5 patients. The half patient was done yesterday up at Addenbrooke's. So we have transplanted, so this is between us and Sweden. Sweden have done 2 transplants and we've done 8 patients. We hope to finish off this year, and then we will know in a few years' time whether this has really worked. So far we've seen no problems with it, we've seen none of the problems of the other trials, and it's looking very encouraging. But this is a major, so whilst this has been a useful trial, it is a major problem taking this forward, because in order to do this we have to use fetal tissue, which you have to get from abortions. You have to get a lot of it in order to transplant into one side. There's ethical problems, there's logistical problems. So we've only ever seen this trial as a way to get to where we're going to go next, which is with stem cells. So stem cells are the future, and I think this is going to be a major area. So I can tell you in the last 2 years, there has been, so when I started with this trial and getting it all going 10 years ago, the investment from pharma in this area, cell-based therapies in Parkinson's disease, was $0. Currently, in the last 2 years, $500 million has been invested by companies thinking this is going to go to clinic. So this is the hottest area in pharma at the moment, Parkinson's, outside of vaccines. So why is that? Well, stem cells have the advantage that you can grow them indefinitely in the lab. So you can make billions of these things. You can then turn them into what you want to turn them into, and then you know exactly what you're giving the patient. Every transplant patient with fetal tissue has their own collection of fetuses from abortions prepared in their own way and transplanted. So no two transplants are the same. Here, everything will be the same. Now, what stem cells do you want? Well, there's a whole smorgasbord of stem cells you can use, most of which are rubbish. And there's a huge worry in this field that people are going off and having stem cell transplants in clinics which are unlicensed. So there's a paper in the New England Journal, the top medical journal on the planet, 3 weeks ago, reported on 4 patients who had gone to clinics in America to have their age-related macular degeneration, so a problem in the eye, treated in these clinics with cells from the patient's own adipose tissue, fat tissue. Those 4 patients all went from having poor vision to no vision. And they all paid for the privilege of doing that from one of these clinics. So there is a worry that some of these clinics are offering therapies which really are not licensed. So in my view, all of these other therapies which you may read about are not to be trusted, and there will essentially be 2 cells which will provide the stem cells for going to clinic with Parkinson's disease. The first of these, which I'm going to talk about, are these so-called induced pluripotent stem cells. So this is a new concept. So this came in 2006, it was done in mice, 2007 it was done in humans. And the idea here is what you do is you take a adult cell, so typically a skin cell, you can then, so this was Yamanaka in Kyoto in Japan, he then took these skin cells, grew them up, and then worked out that if you gave them a number of factors, you could flip that adult cell right back to its origin. So every single one of us began life with an egg being fertilized. The egg fertilized produces the cells which make up a thing called the blastocysts, and those cells are called embryonic stem cells. So every single cell in our body at some point was an embryonic stem cell, and then it divided and differentiated. These cells are essentially the same. They can turn into any cell in your body, and what they've done is you've tricked one of the adult cells back to its very origin. Now if I can do that, flip it back to its embryonic state, I can then flip it into a dopamine cell, and then I can transplant it. Now obviously there are 2 ways you could do this. You could get a skin cell from anybody, turn it into a dopamine cell and transplant it. Or what people really love is the idea that you take your own skin, flip it into an iPS cell, flip it into a dopamine cell, and then chuck it back in your brain. Now that's terrific, and it has obvious appeal. There are a few problems with it. This currently is a little uncertain how safe all this reprogramming is, but I think it probably is. Secondly, you will have dopamine cells put back into your brain, which come from you, which is great, but you've got Parkinson's disease, so whatever made you have Parkinson's disease may still be in those cells. And thirdly, that process currently costs about £3 million. So as an individual therapy, whilst it's a nice idea, it ain't going to be possible. But nevertheless, this has advanced to the point that in monkeys, in America and in Japan, they can now do this successfully in monkey models of Parkinson's disease. They can take skin cells from these animals or blood cells and turn them into iPS cells and dopamine cells. And it actually, this technology of iPS has gone into the clinic in the same issue of New England Journal saying that 4 people had gone blind with adipose stem cells. This group in Japan had actually turned a patient's skin cells into iPS cells, turned them into cells at the back of the eye, transplanted them into the eye, and showed that they were safe and the vision stabilised in that patient. So these are coming to clinic, and this is very attractive in America because iPS cells obviously don't involve embryos and destroying embryos to make embryonic stem cells. So ethically in America, these are really where people are going. So Verdant and Bayer put $225 million into this in December, and Fujifilm have put $160 million into this through a company called Cellular Dynamics. So both of those are charging towards the clinic. We're more interested in these embryonic stem cells, which are the cells which come from spare embryos. And so essentially what you do here is the same, but here we have IVF programs. When you fertilise the egg, you obviously freeze some of the spare embryos. If people don't use them, they will be destroyed. But for some of these, you can then take them with consent, turn them into embryonic stem cells, and then again turn them into dopamine cells. Now this, we've been working on for 10 years and works incredibly well. So we can now demonstrate in animal models that this here is an embryonic stem cell that's been turned into a dopamine cell transplant, and all this brownness here is dopamine cells and dopamine fibres from a transplant. And here it is at high power. So we can make dopamine cells from embryonic stem cells. We can make them with startling efficiency. So if I was to go into the lab today with a 6-well plate, so a little plate of 6 wells of embryonic stem cells, 16 days later, I would come out with enough cells to treat 500 people with Parkinson's disease. So obviously if I went in with 100 plates, I would be able to treat whatever that is, 50,000 patients. I could treat pretty much everybody. So if all of you came with me in the lab, we would have enough to treat the whole of the UK PD population by the end of the month. So it's a highly efficient, and it works fantastically well. So every time we try it with different batches, with different cells, we get exactly the same effect. So it works incredibly well. So we've got a technique that works, it's very efficient, it's very reproducible, and that is leading us now towards doing a clinical trial in 2 years' time. So all we've got to do now is manufacture these to the clinical grade and test them as the regulatory authorities want. So this will be going to clinic in 2009, subject to nothing going wrong, and people signing the contract on the big grant we got for this, which I'm not allowed to say we've got it, but we have, as long as everyone signs the contract to allow us to do it, which they should do. So that's where we've got to with cell-based therapies. So it's alive and it's going places, and it's going places fast. What about this poor group over here, who obviously are not the group that I said was suitable for cell-based therapies? Is there any hope that we can do anything for this group in the immediate future? Well, the hope here, paradoxically, also lies from information that came from cell transplantation. So those fetal dopamine cells, which I showed you, work very well in some patients, and I showed you that patient had a surviving transplant 24 years later. What they discovered just under 10 years ago was that some of the transplanted dopamine cells had acquired the pathology of Parkinson's disease. So you think, well, that's not that interesting, is it really? But it is, because these dopamine cells come from fetuses. So those dopamine cells are only about 10, 15, at most 24 years old. Most people don't get Parkinson's when they're 10, 15 or 24 years old. And if they do, it's a genetic form that doesn't have Lewy bodies. So this raised the idea that what went wrong in Parkinson's disease was that the disease was spreading into the transplant. So whatever caused Parkinson's in the brain had the capacity to send that pathology into another bit of the brain. And this led to this idea of this prion disease. So prion's a best name for mad cow disease and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So it's not quite the same, but the principle's the same. Namely, what goes wrong in Parkinson's is this protein, which Nushan's going to tell you everything about, which normally exists in the brain, changes in some subtle way in Parkinson's disease. That abnormal form then templates your normal form to become an abnormal form, and it starts to accumulate in the cell and make the cell unwell. It then, when it's got to a certain point, it then escapes from that cell, possibly when the cell dies, and it passes it to another cell. That cell takes it up, and that cell then starts to develop the pathology. So when these papers appeared in 2008 and 2009, the world went mad on this, and I'll show you. There's a whole series of papers looking at this. But this raised this whole idea of a fundamental sea change in what we think goes wrong with Parkinson's, which is that in people with a genetic predisposition, which is only a subtle one, something happens, possibly in the environment, and it changes alpha-synuclein in your nose, or the top of the nose, and in the gut. That protein change, it then spreads up into the lower part of the brain, and from there it spreads throughout the brain, causing Parkinson's progression. Now, if this is true, first of all, you'd expect prodromal Parkinson's to have problems with the gut, smell, sleep and things like that, which is true. And secondly, it means that if it's passing through these from cell to cell, there must be a point at which it sits outside the cell, and if it sits outside the cell, I can produce an immune response to kill it and target it and get rid of it. And so there are all these papers now which have essentially looked at this idea that the protein can spread from cell to cell. And this isn't unique to Parkinson's. People think this goes wrong in Alzheimer's disease and other forms of brain disease. So this whole concept that once the disease starts, it then passes from cell to cell and spreads in that way. So could you stop it by killing off the protein that's spreading from cell to cell? Well, it sounds a bit science fiction, but actually it's already in the clinic. So the idea that you can produce vaccines and immune therapies to kill off the protein is already happening. So Aferis, a company in Vienna, have published now 3 years ago their phase 1. They've got a phase 2 study where they've given people their therapy and show that it affects alpha-synuclein. Whether it makes a difference to the disease, they haven't said. And then earlier this year, there was this paper, appeared in Movement Disorders, about this antibody targeting this protein. So this, and Biogen and another company that are working with. So this has really caught people's imagination, that you get people really early with Parkinson's. You can, I would say, treat the people who can do badly with these type of therapies and see if you can really arrest it. So just to sort of conclude, what I would say is that in 20 years we've said that there seem to be 2 types of Parkinson's disease. We have some reasons to understand why that is, but the therapeutic implications of this are quite clear to us. This group of people are going to be heavily targeted with dopamine cell therapies, which, as I say, are in clinic, and they will come increasingly into clinic in the next 5 or 10 years. There's these other factors which will also be competing for the same group of patients. Over here, we have patients who tend to progress more quickly, and this would be the ideal group to try the vaccines for the immune therapies. And what about the future? What ultimately would you like to do? Well, ultimately what I would suggest is that when someone pops up to your clinic with Parkinson's disease in 2027, what you say is, right, fantastic, I'm going to stick in a stem cell dopamine transplant, I'm going to give you a whack of some immune therapy to get rid of the alpha-synuclein, I'm going to combine the two, and thank you very much, I won't need to see you again, and that will be that. So that is, I think, the vision on where Parkinson's will go in the future, assuming people don't run ahead of where the clinical trials and the data is going. So with that, I was going to finish. I was just going to thank all the people who fund all the work, including Parkinson's UK, who've been very generous towards us, and the EU, and I hope that somehow we will remain closely associated with the EU to get funding through some route or another, because this work will not happen without my collaborators in other countries, particularly Sweden and Italy, and the networks that we have. And this was our group on our retreat in Wells a few weeks ago with a couple of people that we'd invited to come and review our work. Thank you.
Probably take a couple of questions while we change speakers over.
Yes.
I got 2 questions. So you say that it has to do with the gut, that you have some toxin from the environment potentially. I recently learned that the gut actually also has a dopamine storage. So I wonder if that kind of storage could be filled with cells that may be helpful for the brain as well.
Yes. There are dopamine cells in other parts of the body. So almost every dopamine cell you can think of, somebody's trying to put into the brain of someone with Parkinson's disease. So the huge trend was in the 1980s when they took a gland called the adrenal gland, which sits right next door to the kidney, hence adrenal next to it, and that produces a little bit of dopamine. And so there was a very odd paper that appeared in the New England Journal in 1986 showing that if you put the adrenal gland in the brain of people with Parkinson's, they did extremely well. Now, I can bore you rigid about all the problems with that trial, but the consequence of that 2-patient trial was that several hundred people in America had these transplants in an unregulated fashion with no thought. So hundreds of people had it. And it was only 5 years later that someone took the trouble to look at all of the data and said it doesn't work and cause side effects. So the ability to produce dopamine in other cells of the body is true, but the capacity for those cells to be transplanted into the brain and work has not been proven. So the adrenal was one. You have cells in the carotid artery up here called carotid body, which senses oxygen in the blood. That's dopamine. They put those in the brain, they don't work. You have other parts of the so-called sympathetic nervous system up here, sympathetic cervical ganglion. They take that out, put it in the brain, it doesn't work. So basically any other more ethically less contentious bit of body that you could use has failed. So the only cells that work are essentially developing dopamine nerve cells.
Okay. Second question is, because it's the noradrenergic system, and if I remember correctly from my undergrad, then that is connected to our brain waves, and if you're having an expectation that isn't met, then your brain waves are negative, have different electronegativity, and to balance that back, the noradrenergic system has to put some hormones out. So I wonder if we have kind of disturbance in our brain that then leads to an overuse of the system, and so then our system does something. But that's a theory that I've been thinking
Yeah, I mean the
about.
question, why do people develop, why do people develop Parkinson's, and why, is it because it's an age-related thing? Is it related in some way to the use of that system and such like? So I don't think people know. I think what we do know is the dopamine system is very important for lots of behaviours. We know that changes in ratios of dopamine in different bits of the brain affect thinking. There are also other chemical changes that take place in the brain in Parkinson's disease. So how each of those map onto the exact problems, we don't know. But crudely speaking, if you give someone L-Dopa when they first seen with Parkinson's, so Imidapar or Sinemet, they look pretty normal and they feel pretty normal. And if there are other problems in other systems, it's not a major problem at that stage. So we think that this system isn't perfect, making these cells to replace it, but it will be a pretty good approximation to what you need.
Okay, phrase it the other way. Has there been or have there been studies where the people look at the influence of artificial radio frequencies and our electromagnetic fields on the dopamine system in the brain?
Don't know the answer to that. I mean, people have tried electrical stimulation in the brain to treat aspects of Parkinson's disease. Not, people obviously got wires in, but people have also done transcranial magnetic stimulation, put a magnet over people's brains, and they can change networks there, but they never last in terms of their effects. So I think.
I'm asking because we live in an abundance, but we don't see it. It's everywhere. And
It is. But
and
James
we have-
Parkinson lived in a world where that wasn't the case, and he found 6 people walking outside his house in East
Then
End
the
London.
question would be, do we have more people getting this disease?
Well, we don't know. So the problem with that is, of course, your average life expectancy in 1817 was slightly less than it is in 2017. So people obviously didn't live that long. It was not diagnosed by many people. So what we can say is that the incidence of Parkinson's disease, which we measured in 2010, hasn't changed. But those studies we did were the first studies which actually accurately told you what the incidence of this disease was. So people haven't accurately collected these figures, and in years gone by, it would be quite common to say, well, Uncle Bob, he was a bit shaky late in life. What do you expect? So I think the capacity to diagnose it and recognise it was much less obvious than it is nowadays.
I've got a question here.
Oh yes.
It's quite common for tremor dominant to not respond very well to it.
Yeah.
Is there any theories as to why that should be?
Probably because it's not related to the dopamine cell loss would be the simple answer. It's very true. So as you know, we've discussed this before. So people who have a lot of tremor with their Parkinson's disease, the good news is that those people progress much less quickly, assuming they've got Parkinson's disease. So in the old days, before we could do some scanning, people with tremor may not actually even had Parkinson's disease. They may just have had a tremor for some other reason. But people with tremor dominant disease or tremor persistent disease tend to progress very slowly, but the drugs we currently use don't help so much for that. And so the theory is that the tremor of Parkinson's disease may be driven as much by loss in another system, I think called the serotonin 5-HT system, which sits nearby, as much as it is to dopamine. So if you're thinking of using these dopamine cell-based therapies, probably taking people who have a lot of tremor wouldn't be the sensible thing to do, because it's probably not the best way to treat it with that approach. And the trouble with these trials is that if you get a negative trial, it's very hard to come back from it.
I was going to say, is there any idea of what is the environmental toxin that leads to the development of the disease?
The simple answer is no. And what people have spent a lot of time thinking about is pesticides and insecticides. So there's this very famous cases from the 1980s, early 1980s, where there were a group of drug addicts in California who developed acute Parkinson's. And that's because the drug they were injecting got contaminated with something called MPTP. And MPTP looked quite a lot like paraquat. So people then started to think, well, it's the paraquat insecticide, pesticide type things that might be causing it. Now that's incredibly difficult to do.
But also that didn't exist 200 years ago.
It didn't exist 200 years ago. There may have been something similar, or it may just increase your risk of getting it rather than absolutely triggering it. So people went off looking for it, and some people said they found it, some people didn't. I think the real problem is that if we believe this hypothesis that Parkinson's disease begins way before you develop all the motor features, actually the critical time when you're exposed to a toxin is not the 12 months up to come and see your GP or doctor. It may be 12 years ago, in fact maybe 25 years ago. So you try and remember what you were exposed to 25 years ago, and of course you won't remember. And what you do remember are the things you think are important. So people will always tell you, yes, well, because this became quite a popular theory, people said, yeah, I was in a greenhouse 20 years ago, I remember now. And I forgot to open the windows, and I sprayed my tomato plants, and then I felt absolutely ghastly, and I know that's what caused it. And then the other one which people got interested in is manganese. So if you're a Chinese manganese miner, you have a high incidence of Parkinson's because manganese can affect the bit of the brain where dopamine works. And then it was thought to be associated with welders. So this became a big thing in America. Welders had a much higher risk of Parkinson's. So somebody said, I want to study this. Anyone, I want to see welders with Parkinson's. So he got lots of people turning up and saying, well, there we go. Of course, the problem was all the people who were welders who didn't have Parkinson's obviously wouldn't come to his clinic. So he just selected all the people who had it. So that didn't prove to last the test of time. But a lot of people made a lot of money out of that for defending this as a cause. So I think we don't really know is the honest answer. And it's very difficult to know. So one study in Cambridge, which is very good, is that, which might get to it, is they have these big population studies where they looked at people with cancer. So these sort of epic studies. So back in the 90s, they collected thousands of people in their 40s and just collected information, and collect information every 5 years. And of course, the idea was that 20, 30 years later, you'll say, oh, there's a group of people who've got stomach cancer. 20, 30 years ago, was there something in their diet, their occupation that predisposed for that? Well, now that population is 60 or 70. They're starting to get Parkinson's disease. So there's a hope one can go back.